I never thought I would become the kind of person who would let someone's basement flood on purpose. But after what the Ridgemont Heights HOA put me through, I stopped caring about being the bigger person. My name is Frank Thornton, and I am a 42-year-old software engineer who works from home in Madison, Wisconsin. I moved into this suburban neighborhood 3 years ago thinking it would be the perfect place to settle down after my divorce. The house was a beautiful 2-story colonial with a decent yard, and the neighborhood seemed quiet enough. What I did not know was that the Ridgemont Heights Homeowners Association was run by a woman named Karen Westfield, who treated the HOA rules like they were federal law. The problem started last March when we had a severe ice storm that knocked out power to half the city. I had invested in a backup generator 6 months earlier, specifically for situations like this, because I needed to keep my servers running for work. The generator sat on a concrete pad behind my detached garage, well within my property lines and installed by a licensed electrician, according to code. When the power went out at 2 in the morning, I went outside in the freezing rain and got that generator running. The thing hummed away for about 18 hours until the power company restored electricity to our grid. I thought nothing of it. I had done what any reasonable person would do to keep their home functioning during an emergency. But 3 days later, I found a certified letter in my mailbox from the HOA. Inside was a fine for $500 for violating noise ordinances during overnight hours. I read that letter 3 times trying to make sense of it. According to the HOA bylaws that Karen had apparently rewritten without a proper vote, generators could only be operated between the hours of 8 in the morning and 8 at night. Never mind that the entire point of a backup generator was to provide power during emergencies that did not conveniently happen during business hours. Never mind that half the neighborhood had been without heat in below freezing temperatures. I called the HOA office the next morning and got Karen on the phone. She had that particular tone that certain middle-aged women perfect over years of practice, the one that sounds pleasant on the surface, but carries an undercurrent of absolute authority that brooks no disagreement. "Mr. Thornton, the rules are quite clear," she said when I explained the situation. "Generator operation is restricted to daytime hours to minimize noise pollution in our community." "Karen, it was an emergency. The power was out. People needed heat." "The rules do not make exceptions for perceived emergencies. If everyone decided rules did not apply to them during inconvenient times, we would have chaos. Perceived emergencies. It was 10 degrees outside. You should have prepared better." Many residents have battery backup systems that operate silently. I felt my jaw tighten. A battery backup system that could run a whole house for 18 hours would cost $40,000. "That sounds like a personal financial decision, Mr. Thornton. The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay or we will place a lien on your property." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. I had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, paid my dues on time, kept my lawn maintained, never caused problems. And now I was being fined $500 for keeping my house warm during an ice storm. I decided to fight it. I requested a hearing with the HOA board, which according to the bylaws was my right as a homeowner. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that mostly sat empty except for HOA meetings and the occasional garage sale. When I arrived that evening, I found the board already seated at a folding table at the front of the room. Karen sat in the middle, flanked by 2 other board members whose names I barely knew. Marcus Hendricks was a retired accountant who mostly nodded along with whatever Karen said. Patricia Vance was in her 60s and seemed like she might have been reasonable once, but had long since given up trying to stand up to Karen. About a dozen other residents sat in the chairs facing the board. Most of them were there for other issues, waiting their turn. The whole setup felt like a kangaroo court, and I had not even presented my case yet. When Karen called my name, I walked to the front with the folder I had prepared. Inside were printouts of Wisconsin state laws regarding emergency generator use, documentation of the power outage from the utility company, and photographs showing how far my generator was from the nearest neighboring house. Mr. Thornton, you are here to contest the fine levied against you for violating noise ordinances. Please present your case, Karen said in that same artificially pleasant tone. I took a breath and launched into my explanation. I covered everything: the emergency nature of the power outage, the distance of my generator from other homes, the fact that I had installed it properly with all required permits. I cited the state laws that specifically protected homeowners' rights to operate emergency backup equipment. I pointed out that the HOA's generator restrictions were likely unenforceable because they conflicted with state statutes. Karen listened with a frozen smile on her face. When I finished, she glanced at Marcus and Patricia, then back to me. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Thornton. However, the board finds that the HOA rules are clear and binding. When you purchased your home, you signed the covenant agreeing to abide by all HOA regulations. The fine stands. You did not address any of my points about state law. HOA covenants supersede general state regulations in matters of community standards. That is not how the law works, Karen. Her smile tightened. The board has made its decision. You have 30 days to remit payment. Next case, please. I stood there for a moment, furious and stunned. Then I walked out. Behind me, I could hear Karen calling the next homeowner to the front. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm down. Over the next week, I did some research. I found a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and set up a consultation. Her name was Jennifer Park, and she had an office in downtown Madison. When I explained the situation, she nodded sympathetically. Unfortunately, this is more common than you would think, she said. HOAs often overreach their authority, and homeowners either pay the fines or spend thousands fighting them in court. Can I win if I fight it? Probably. Based on what you have told me, the HOA restriction conflicts with state law, which means it is unenforceable. But it would cost you at least $3,000 in legal fees to take this to court, possibly more if it drags out. For a $500 fine, most people just pay. So they can just extort money from people. She gave me a rueful smile. Essentially, yes, that is the problem with HOAs. They have a lot of power and very little oversight. I left her office feeling defeated. $3,000 to fight a $500 fine did not make financial sense, no matter how much I wanted to prove a point. But paying the fine felt like admitting Karen was right, and I could not stomach that either. Then something happened that changed everything. 2 weeks after my hearing, I was working in my home office when I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find my neighbor David Chen standing there looking worried. "Hey Frank, you got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, what is going on?" David was in his late 50s, a chemist who worked at the university. We were not close friends, but we were friendly enough, the kind of neighbors who waved when we saw each other and occasionally borrowed tools. "I wanted to give you a heads up. Karen came by my house yesterday asking questions about your generator. She wanted to know if it had disturbed me during the power outage." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that I barely heard it and I was grateful someone in the neighborhood had heat. But Frank, she is not done with you. She mentioned something about forcing you to remove the generator entirely if you could not follow the rules. My stomach dropped. She cannot do that. I have permits from the city. I am just telling you what she said. I thought you should know. After David left, I spent the rest of the day distracted and angry. The idea that Karen would try to force me to remove my generator was insane. I had spent $3,000 on that system. It was properly installed and completely legal. But I was starting to understand that Karen did not care about what was legal or reasonable. She cared about control. The next day, I paid the $500 fine. It physically hurt to write that check, but I decided I needed to pick my battles. I told myself I would just keep my head down and avoid giving Karen any more ammunition. That resolution lasted about 3 weeks until the next power outage. This one hit on a Tuesday afternoon in April. A severe thunderstorm rolled through Madison with straight-line winds that knocked down trees and power lines all over the city. My power went out at 4 in the afternoon. I stood in my living room looking out at the gray sky and pouring rain, thinking about my generator sitting behind the garage. The power company had estimated restoration would take 12 to 24 hours. I had work deadlines. My refrigerator was full of food that would spoil. And it was still before 8 at night, which meant I was technically within the HOA's ridiculous operating hours. I went out and started the generator. It fired up smoothly and the transfer switch kicked in, restoring power to my house. I went back inside, dried off, and got back to work. At 7:45, right before the 8 o'clock cutoff, someone started pounding on my front door. I knew before I opened it who I would find. Karen stood on my porch in a yellow raincoat, water dripping off the hood. Her face was red and her eyes were bright with anger. "Turn it off," she demanded. "Turn what off? Do not play games with me, Mr. Thornton. Your generator. Turn it off right now. It is 7:45. I am within the permitted hours. In 15 minutes you will be in violation again. I am giving you advance notice to shut it down." I stared at her. "Karen, the power is out." "Are you seriously telling me I have to turn off my generator at 8 o'clock and sit in the dark because of your arbitrary rule?" "The rules are not arbitrary. They protect the quality of life for all residents. The power is out for the whole neighborhood. Everyone is dealing with the same situation. Then everyone can deal with it silently after 8 o'clock. Turn off the generator or you will receive another fine." She turned and walked back to her car, which was parked at the curb with its hazard lights flashing. I watched her drive away, then checked my watch. 14 minutes until 8. I left the generator running. I did not shut it off at 8 o'clock. I did not shut it off at 9 or 10 or midnight. I ran it all night long until the power company restored electricity the next morning at 11. And when the inevitable fine notice arrived in my mailbox 3 days later, this time for $1,000 because I was a repeat offender, I barely felt surprised. But I also noticed something interesting in that fine notice. It included a grainy photograph of my house at night with the windows lit up, time stamped at 10:37. Karen had driven back to my house to document my violation. She had taken the time and effort to build her case against me. That told me this was personal for her. This was not about noise ordinances or community standards. This was about her establishing dominance over someone who had dared to question her authority. I sat at my kitchen table looking at that fine notice and the photograph, and something hardened inside me. I had tried to be reasonable. I had followed her rules even when they were stupid. I had paid her extortion money, and she was still coming after me. That was when I started paying attention to Karen's house. not in a creepy way, but in an observant way. I noticed the little details I had overlooked before. Karen lived 4 houses down from me in a larger colonial that backed up to a small retention pond the neighborhood shared. I noticed that during heavy rains, her sump pump would kick on and run for hours, keeping her basement from flooding. I noticed this because I could hear it. See, Karen's sump pump discharged into the storm drain near the street, and the drain was right at the property line between her house and the empty lot next door. When the pump ran, you could hear the water gurgling out if you walked past. I noticed something else too. That sump pump was loud. Not generator loud, but definitely audible. And it ran at all hours of the day and night when it rained. It ran at 2 in the morning. It ran at 4 in the morning. It ran whenever the water table in her basement got too high, regardless of what time it was. The HOA rules about noise ordinances applied to all mechanical equipment operated on residential properties. I checked. I read through the entire covenant document, all 47 pages of poorly written legalese. The generator restriction was part of a broader noise ordinance that prohibited the operation of loud mechanical devices between 8 at night and 8 in the morning. Karen's sump pump was a loud mechanical device, and she ran it outside the permitted hours all the time. I started documenting it. I took my phone and walked past her house at night when it was raining, recording video of the sump pump discharge with the time stamp clearly visible. I did this over the course of 3 weeks and compiled about a dozen videos showing her sump pump operating between 9 at night and 6 in the morning. Then, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA. I submitted all my evidence along with a request that Karen be fined according to the same standards she had applied to my generator. I sent it certified mail to make sure there was a record. The response came faster than I expected. 2 days after I filed the complaint, Karen called me. Not from the HOA office number, but from her personal cell phone. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded. No pretense of pleasantness this time. "I am filing a legitimate complaint about noise violations in our neighborhood. That sump pump is essential equipment. It prevents flooding." Interesting. My generator is essential equipment too. It prevents freezing and food spoilage during power outages. This is different. How is it different, Karen? Your own rules say no loud mechanical devices between 8 at night and 8 in the morning. Your sump pump is loud and it runs all night when it rains. You are in violation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was colder, more controlled. "If you pursue this complaint, I will make your life in this neighborhood very difficult. You are already doing that. You have no idea what I can do. I have been running this HOA for 8 years. I know every rule, every loophole, every lever of power. If you want to go to war with me, you will lose. Then I guess we will see what happens." I hung up before she could respond. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking slightly, but I felt something I had not felt in months. I felt like I had some power back. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. My complaint was added to the agenda. I showed up early and took a seat in the front row. As other residents filtered in, I noticed Karen watching me from her position at the board table. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. When they got to my complaint on the agenda, Karen addressed it herself rather than having someone else read it. "We have received a complaint from Mr. Thornton regarding alleged noise violations from a sump pump at my residence," she said. "I have reviewed this complaint and determined it to be frivolous and retaliatory in nature. Sump pumps are necessary safety equipment that prevent property damage. They are exempt from noise ordinances under the Emergency Equipment Clause. I stood up. There is no emergency equipment clause in the HOA covenant. Sit down, Mr. Thornton. You will have a chance to speak. Actually, I am speaking now. You just made up an exception that does not exist in the written rules. And if we are creating exceptions for emergency equipment, then my generator should qualify too. Marcus and Patricia were both looking uncomfortable. A few other residents were watching with obvious interest. This was probably the most drama the monthly HOA meeting had seen in years. Karen's face flushed. Mr. Thornton, you are out of order. Show me the emergency equipment clause. I have read the entire covenant. It does not exist. The board has the authority to interpret the covenant as needed to address unanticipated situations. So you are giving yourself a pass on rules you enforce against everyone else. The room was dead silent. Karen looked like she wanted to climb over the table and strangle me. Patricia leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Karen listened, then took a breath. The board will take Mr. Thornton's complaint under advisement and issue a decision within 30 days. That was it. They moved on to the next agenda item and I sat back down, my pulse racing. I had not expected to win anything at that meeting, but I had accomplished something almost as good. I had put Karen on the defensive in front of other residents. I had shown that she was willing to bend her own rules when they affected her. Over the next few days, I started hearing from other neighbors. People I barely knew were stopping me when I was getting my mail or mowing my lawn. They told me stories about Karen. About fines they had received for minor infractions like leaving their garbage cans out an hour too late or having grass that was a quarter-inch too tall. About the way she drove through the neighborhood looking for violations like a cop looking to fill a ticket quota. David Chen told me that Karen had tried to fine him $300 because one of his deck boards was a slightly different shade of gray than the others after he replaced it. Another neighbor, Susan Martinez, said Karen had threatened to fine her for having a vegetable garden in her front yard, even though the covenant said nothing about gardens. I realized that I was not the only person who had a problem with Karen. I was just the only one who had decided to push back. Everyone else had either paid their fines or given in to her demands because fighting seemed futile. But I had another advantage that most of my neighbors did not. I was a software engineer with no kids and plenty of free time. I could afford to be petty. I could afford to spend hours documenting violations and researching regulations. And after the way Karen had treated me, I was motivated. The 30-day deadline for the board's decision on my complaint came and went with no response. I sent a follow-up email. No response. I sent another certified letter. Still nothing, so I filed another complaint. This time I documented 6 more nights when Karen's sump pump had run between 8 at night and 8 in the morning. I compiled the video evidence into a single file with timestamps and submitted it along with a formal demand that the board either fine Karen according to their own rules or amend the rules to create an explicit exemption for emergency equipment that would apply to everyone equally. That got a response. Karen sent me a letter stating that my complaint was harassment and that if I continued to file frivolous complaints, the board would take legal action against me for interfering with HOA operations. I took that letter to Jennifer Park, the HOA lawyer. She read it and actually laughed. "This is absurd," she said. "You are filing legitimate complaints through the proper channels. That is not harassment. That is using the system exactly as it was designed. Can she actually sue me? She can file a lawsuit for anything, but she would lose. And honestly, if you wanted to countersue at that point, you would have a decent case for selective enforcement and abuse of authority." I left her office with a new idea forming. I did not want to spend thousands of dollars on a lawsuit. But I wanted Karen to understand that she could not just bully people into submission. Then fate handed me an opportunity I had not expected. In early June, we had a stretch of dry weather. No rain for almost 3 weeks, which was unusual for Wisconsin in early summer. The retention pond behind Karen's house got lower and lower, and her sump pump, which had been my main evidence of her hypocrisy, went silent. At first, I was frustrated. Without the sump pump running, I could not document any more violations. But then, I started thinking about the mechanics of the situation. Karen's house was in a low spot of the neighborhood. During the spring and after heavy rains, the water table rose, and her basement would flood without the sump pump running constantly. The pump pulled water out of a sump pit in her basement and discharged it outside, keeping the basement dry. But the pump itself was not foolproof. It required electricity to run, and if the electricity went out during a rainstorm, the pump would not work and her basement would flood. That was why most people with chronic basement water problems installed battery backup systems for their sump pumps. I did not know if Karen had a battery backup, but I had a feeling that if she did, she would have mentioned it during one of our arguments about my generator. She would have held it up as an example of proper preparation. I started watching the weather forecasts obsessively. June turned into July, and the dry spell finally broke. The forecast showed a major storm system moving in from Iowa, with predictions of 2 to 3 inches of rain and possible severe weather. The storm was expected to hit on a Thursday night. I watched the radar on my phone as the line of thunderstorms crept closer to Madison. Around 9 at night, the rain started. Light at first, then building to a heavy downpour. Thunder rumbled and lightning flashed. The wind picked up, bending the trees in my yard. At 9:30, my power went out. I sat in the dark, listening to the rain hammer against my windows and the wind howl around the house. I did not start my generator. I sat there in the dark and waited. I knew the power was out in Karen's house too. I knew that water was rising in the ground around her foundation. I knew that without electricity, her sump pump was not running. And I knew that if this storm dropped as much rain as predicted, her basement was going to flood. I could have done something. I could have gone over to her house and offered to run an extension cord from my generator to her sump pump. I could have been the bigger person, the good neighbor who helped out despite our conflict, but I did not. I sat in my dark house and listened to the storm and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sympathy, no urge to help. Karen had spent months making my life miserable over a generator I ran during emergencies. She had fined me $1,500 total. She had threatened me and tried to force me to remove essential equipment from my property. She had abused her power as HOA president to bully not just me but dozens of other residents, so I let her sump pump fail. I let the water rise in her basement. I let her deal with the consequences of the same kind of emergency she had punished me for preparing to handle. The storm lasted for about 3 hours. By midnight, it had passed and moved east toward Milwaukee. The rain stopped, but the power stayed out. I finally went to bed around 1 in the morning, still with no electricity. The power came back on around 6. I woke up to my alarm clock blinking and the sound of my refrigerator restarting. I got up, made coffee, and went through my normal morning routine. Around 8, I went outside to check for any storm damage in my yard. That was when I saw Karen. She was standing in her driveway 4 houses down, talking on her phone. Even from a distance, I could see she was upset. She was gesturing emphatically with one hand while pacing back and forth. Over the next hour, I watched from my window as a procession of vehicles arrived at her house. First a plumber's van, then a truck from a water damage restoration company, then another truck with industrial equipment. People were going in and out of her house carrying equipment and hoses. David Chen stopped by around noon. He had seen the activity too. "Did you hear what happened?" he asked. "No, what?" "Karen's basement flooded during the storm last night. Apparently, she has about 3 feet of water down there. The power outage knocked out her sump pump and the battery backup failed, or maybe she did not have one. I heard her telling someone on the phone that she has thousands of dollars in damage." I made appropriate sympathetic noises, but inside I felt a cold satisfaction. David lingered for a moment like he wanted to say something else. "You know, it is kind of ironic," he finally said. "All those fines she gave you about your generator and she ends up needing backup power herself." "Yeah," I said. "That is pretty ironic." David left and I went back inside. Part of me felt like I should feel worse about what I had done, or more accurately, what I had not done. But mostly, I just felt like justice had been served in a weird, karmic kind of way. The real fallout started a few days later. I got a letter from the HOA calling an emergency board meeting to discuss recent storm damage and neighborhood preparedness. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. I almost did not go. I had no obligation to attend, and I suspected it was just going to be Karen trying to rally support for some new rule or assessment. But curiosity got the better of me. The community center was more crowded than I had ever seen it for an HOA meeting. Every chair was filled and people were standing along the walls. Apparently word had spread that something interesting was going to happen. Karen stood at the front of the room next to the board table instead of sitting behind it. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was not wearing makeup. For the first time since I had known her, she looked like a regular person dealing with a crisis rather than an authority figure in control of everything. "Thank you all for coming," she started. "As many of you know, my home sustained significant flood damage during the storm last Thursday. My basement had approximately 30 inches of water that destroyed my water heater, furnace, and most of the belongings I had stored down there. The damage is estimated at over $40,000. There were sympathetic murmurs from the crowd. Karen continued. "This happened because the power outage disabled my sump pump at the worst possible time. I did not have adequate backup power to keep the pump running, and it made me realize that our neighborhood is not prepared for these kinds of emergencies. I had a sinking feeling about where this was going. I am proposing that we amend the HOA covenant to require all homeowners to install battery backup systems for essential equipment like sump pumps. Additionally, I am proposing that we lift the restrictions on generator operation during power outages." The room erupted. Half the people started talking at once. Someone behind me muttered something about costs. Someone else said it was about time. I just sat there trying to process what I was hearing. Karen held up her hand for quiet. "I know this is a significant change, and I take responsibility for not recognizing sooner how important backup power is. Going forward, I think we need to prioritize safety and preparation over noise concerns." I stood up before I realized I was going to. "Karen, 3 months ago you fined me $1,500 for running my generator during power outages. You told me I should have prepared better. You threatened to make me remove my generator. And now you want to change the rules because you experienced the same kind of emergency you punished me for." The room went dead silent. Everyone was looking at either me or Karen. Her face flushed red, but she met my eyes. "You are right," she said quietly. "I was wrong. I let my focus on enforcing rules override common sense. I am sorry, Mr. Thornton. I am sorry to you and to everyone else I have been too harsh with." What happened to my house made me realize that I have been treating this neighborhood like a dictatorship instead of a community. I had not expected that. An apology from Karen Westfield was something I thought I would never hear. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then Patricia Vance spoke up from the board table. "I have something to say too. I have been on this board for 6 years, and I have gone along with a lot of decisions I was not comfortable with because it was easier than arguing. But I think we need to do more than just change the rules about generators. I think we need to look at how we have been operating this HOA and make some bigger changes." Marcus Hendricks nodded. "I agree. We have been too aggressive with fines and enforcement. We have treated homeowners like they are trying to get away with something instead of recognizing that people are just trying to live their lives." I sat back down, stunned. This meeting had turned into something completely different than what I expected. Other residents started speaking up, sharing their own stories of excessive fines and petty enforcement actions. It was like Karen's apology had opened floodgates that had been building pressure for years. The meeting lasted for almost 3 hours. By the end, the board had agreed to form a committee to review all HOA rules and make recommendations for changes. They voted unanimously to immediately suspend the generator restrictions, and Karen announced that she would be refunding my $1,500 in fines plus interest. As people filed out afterward, several neighbors stopped to thank me for standing up to Karen. One older man named Walter shook my hand and said I had done something he wished he had the guts to do years ago. Karen was still at the front of the room packing up papers when most people had left. I almost walked out without saying anything, but something made me go over to her. "I am sorry about your basement," I said. "I really am." She looked up at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed like she had been crying recently. "Are you? I would not blame you if you were not. I mean it. $40,000 in damage is terrible. I know you knew the power was out Thursday night. I know you had your generator and could have helped, and I do not blame you for not doing it. I would not have helped me either after the way I treated you." I did not know what to say to that. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment. "Why did you apologize tonight?" I finally asked. "You could have just changed the rules without admitting you were wrong." "Because I was sitting in my flooded basement at 2 in the morning waiting for the restoration company to arrive. And I realized I had turned into exactly the kind of person I used to hate. When I first joined this board, it was because I wanted to help maintain property values and keep the neighborhood nice. But somewhere along the way, it became about control. It became about making sure everyone followed rules whether the rules made sense or not. And I lost sight of the fact that I was dealing with real people and real lives. So what happens now? Now I try to do better. We all try to do better. That is all we can do. I left the community center that night feeling strange. I had gotten what I wanted in terms of the rule changes and the refund, but I did not feel the triumphant satisfaction I thought I would. Mostly, I just felt tired. Over the next few weeks, the HOA committee got to work reviewing the covenant. They held open meetings where residents could provide input. I attended a few and was impressed by how different the tone was. People were actually listening to each other instead of just defending their positions. They made a lot of changes. They eliminated dozens of petty rules about things like garbage can placement and grass height tolerances. They created a formal appeals process for fines that included oversight from the full neighborhood, not just the board. They put term limits on board positions, so no one person could control the HOA for years on end. Karen stayed on the board through the transition, but announced she would not run for re-election when her term ended in December. At the September meeting, she formally presented me with a check for $1,650, which included my fine refunds plus 6% interest. She did it publicly and shook my hand. "I hope we can be better neighbors going forward," she said. "I think we can," I replied. The transformation of the Ridgemont Heights HOA became kind of famous in local homeowner circles. Jennifer Park, my lawyer, told me she had heard about it from other clients who were dealing with their own HOA problems. Some of them asked if I would come speak at their meetings about standing up to board overreach. I declined those invitations. I was not interested in becoming a professional HOA rebel. I just wanted to live in my house and not deal with stupid fines. But I did agree to join the HOA committee working on rule revisions. If I was going to complain about how things were done, I figured I should help fix them. It was actually interesting work once I got into it. We were basically writing a constitution for a tiny government, trying to balance the need for standards with respect for individual homeowners' autonomy. By the time winter rolled around again, I barely recognized the HOA I had been at war with just months earlier. The new board was elected in December, and it included a mix of people who actually seemed interested in community building rather than rule enforcement. Karen did not run again as she had promised. She attended the December meeting as a regular resident and applauded when the new board was seated. In January, we had another ice storm. This one was worse than the previous year, with power out for almost 3 days in some areas. My generator ran continuously for 48 hours. Nobody complained. Nobody fined me. Several neighbors actually stopped by to charge their phones and get some hot coffee. I also noticed that a few other houses on my street had installed generators over the fall. The portable kind that you could wheel out of a garage when needed. David Chen told me he had gotten one after watching me deal with the HOA mess, and deciding he did not want to be caught unprepared. On the second night of the outage, around 10 at night, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find Karen standing there with a flashlight. "Hey Frank, I hate to bother you, but my pipes are starting to freeze. I lost power about 6 hours ago. Do you think I could run an extension cord from your generator just to keep my furnace going? I will pay you for the gas." For a split second, part of me wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to remind her of all the grief she had given me about my generator, but that impulse passed quickly. "Yeah, of course. I have got a heavy-duty cord that should reach. Let me get it." We spent about 20 minutes running the extension cord from my generator to her house and getting her furnace restarted. Her basement had been completely repaired after the flood, with a new furnace and water heater and fresh drywall. She had also installed a battery backup for her sump pump, though she did not need it right now since everything was frozen. "Thank you for this," she said as we stood in her living room listening to her furnace kick on. "Really? No problem. That is what neighbors do," she smiled. It was a real smile, not the tight artificial one I had gotten used to seeing on her face. Yes, that is what neighbors do. The power came back on the next afternoon. I unplugged Karen's extension cord and coiled it back up. She came over that evening with a plate of homemade cookies as a thank you. Life in Ridgemont Heights settled into a new normal after that. The HOA still existed and still had rules, but they were reasonable rules enforced with common sense. The monthly meetings were shorter and less contentious. People actually talked to each other in the neighborhood now instead of just waving awkwardly and hurrying inside. I kept my generator maintained and ready, though I did not have to use it much over the next year. Every time I walked past it behind my garage, I remembered the whole saga that had started with a simple ice storm and escalated into a full-blown war with the HOA. The irony was not lost on me that the resolution had ultimately come from Karen's basement flooding. If that had not happened, I do not know if anything would have changed. She might have continued being a petty tyrant, and I might have continued fighting back through complaints and documentation. We could have spent years locked in mutually assured misery. Sometimes I wondered if I should feel guilty about not helping her during that storm. I could have prevented the flooding. I could have been the better person. But every time I started to feel bad about it, I remembered the way she had threatened me, the way she had abused her authority, the way she had made not just my life, but dozens of other people's lives harder for no good reason. I had not caused her basement to flood. I had just chosen not to prevent it. There was a difference, even if it was a subtle one. And maybe if I had stepped in and saved her from the consequences of her own lack of preparation, she never would have learned anything. She never would have apologized. The HOA never would have changed. So in a weird way, the flood had been necessary. It had been the wake-up call Karen needed and the catalyst for real change in the neighborhood. That did not mean I was glad it happened, but I had made peace with my role in not preventing it. A year after everything started, I was doing some work in my yard when David Chen came over. We talked for a while about his work at the university and my latest consulting project. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "You know, you changed this neighborhood. Before you stood up to Karen, everyone just accepted that the HOA was going to be terrible and there was nothing we could do about it. You showed us that you could push back." "I was just tired of being pushed around," I said. "Yeah, but you did something about it. Most people just complain and then pay the fine and move on. You actually fought." "I am not sure I fought very honorably. I mean, I let her basement flood." David shrugged. "You did not let anything happen. You just did not bail out someone who had been making your life hell. That is not the same as actively hurting her, I guess. Plus, look at the results. We have an HOA that actually functions now. Property values are up because people want to live here again. Karen is a regular human being instead of a power-hungry dictator, all because you stood your ground." I had not thought about it that way. I had been so focused on my own grievances and my own petty revenge that I had not considered the broader impact. But David was right. The neighborhood was genuinely better now than it had been a year ago. That spring, the Ridgemont Heights HOA was featured in a local news story about homeowner associations that had successfully reformed themselves. A reporter interviewed several residents, including me and Karen. It was weird seeing myself on the evening news talking about generator fines and flooded basements. The story got picked up by a few national outlets as a human interest piece. I started getting emails from people all over the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares. Some of them wanted advice. Others just wanted to vent about their situations. I tried to respond to as many as I could, but eventually I had to stop because it was taking up too much of my time. The attention died down after a few weeks. Life went back to normal. I worked from home, maintained my house, and occasionally attended HOA meetings when there was something important on the agenda. I even volunteered to help with the neighborhood 4th of July party, which was something I never would have considered doing during the height of my conflict with Karen. 2 years after the generator war, I was at a neighborhood barbecue when Karen came over to where I was standing with a group of other residents. She had a beer in her hand and looked relaxed. "I have been thinking about putting in a whole house generator," she said to the group. "Something that kicks on automatically when the power goes out. Frank, do you have recommendations for contractors?" Everyone laughed, including me. The fact that Karen was openly discussing backup generators at a neighborhood party would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. But now it was just a normal conversation. "Yeah, I can give you the name of the guy who installed mine," I said. "He does good work." "Thanks. I figure I should practice what I preach now, right? Be prepared and all that. It is a good investment, especially if you have basement water issues." She rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Do not remind me. I am pretty sure I am still paying off that flood damage." We talked for a while about generators and home improvements and other mundane topics. It was strange how normal it felt. Karen was just another neighbor now, not an adversary or a reformed villain. Just a person who had made mistakes and was trying to do better. Later that evening, as the party was winding down, I found myself thinking about the whole experience. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I would end up being friendly with Karen Westfield, I would have laughed in their face. But people could change. Situations could evolve. And sometimes the worst conflicts could lead to the best outcomes if everyone was willing to learn from them. I never did find out if Karen knew that I had been aware of the power outage during the storm that flooded her basement. We never discussed it directly. Part of me suspected she had figured it out, but she never confronted me about it. Maybe she understood that I had been put in an impossible position by her own actions. Maybe she did not want to reopen old wounds. Or maybe she genuinely did not realize that I could have helped and chose not to. Whatever the reason, it remained an unspoken thing between us. A piece of history that we both knew existed, but had tacitly agreed not to examine too closely. Some things were better left buried. 3 years after everything started, the HOA held an anniversary celebration of the covenant reforms. They put up a plaque in the community center commemorating the changes and thanking the residents who had been involved in the process. My name was on that plaque along with about a dozen others. At the ceremony, the current HOA president gave a speech about how the neighborhood had transformed itself from a place where residents feared the board into a genuine community. She talked about the importance of balancing rules with common sense and authority with accountability. Karen was there, sitting in the audience with everyone else. When the president finished speaking, everyone applauded. Then someone started a chant of speech, directed at Karen. She looked embarrassed but eventually stood up. "I am not really prepared to say anything," she started. "But I guess I want to acknowledge that the changes we celebrate tonight came from failure. My failure specifically. I failed as a leader by prioritizing control over community. I failed as a neighbor by treating people like problems to be managed instead of human beings to be respected. And it took a pretty dramatic wake-up call to make me see that." She paused and looked directly at me. "Frank Thornton stood up to me when I needed someone to stand up to me. He could have just paid his fines and moved on with his life. Instead, he fought back and forced me to confront how I had been running this HOA. I am grateful to him for that, even though I am pretty sure I did not feel grateful at the time." There was laughter and more applause. Karen sat back down. The president asked if anyone else wanted to speak. I stayed in my seat. I had said everything I needed to say over the past 3 years through my actions and my work on the committee. I did not need to give a speech. The ceremony ended and people mingled, eating cookies and drinking punch and talking about neighborhood gossip. I was getting ready to leave when Karen caught up with me near the door. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. "Sure." We stepped outside into the warm evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. "I have never directly apologized for what I put you through," Karen said. "Not really. I apologized to the group and I changed my behavior, but I have never looked you in the eye and said I am sorry for targeting you, for fining you unreasonably, for threatening you, for making your life miserable. So I am saying it now. I am truly sorry, Frank. You did not deserve any of that." "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that. Can I ask you something? And you do not have to answer if you do not want to. That night my basement flooded when the power was out. Did you know there it was? The question I had been half expecting for 3 years. I could have lied. I could have said I had been asleep or I had not realized her power was out too, but I did not want to lie. Yeah, I knew. She nodded slowly. And you chose not to help. I chose not to help someone who had been actively trying to make my life harder for months. Someone who had fined me $1,500 for doing exactly what you ended up needing to do yourself. Someone who had shown me no mercy or understanding when I was dealing with emergencies. So no, I did not rush over to save you from the consequences of not having backup power. I get it. I do. I just needed to know. Are you angry? No. Honestly, I think if the situation had been reversed, I would have done the same thing, maybe worse. You had every right to let me deal with my own emergency after the way I treated you. We stood there in silence for a moment, watching the sunset. For what it is worth, I said, I am not proud of it. I am not proud of sitting in my dark house knowing your basement was flooding and choosing to do nothing. But I also do not regret it. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. I caused that situation through my own actions. What happened to me was just karma. Pretty expensive karma, she laughed. Yeah, $40,000 worth, but it was a lesson I needed to learn. And honestly, the money I spent fixing my basement was probably less than what I would have eventually spent on legal fees when someone finally sued the HOA for harassment. You really think someone would have sued? Frank, I was one more ridiculous fine away from getting hit with a lawsuit. You were not the only person I targeted. There were at least 3 other residents who were documenting violations and talking to lawyers. The HOA was a disaster waiting to happen, and I was the one driving it toward the cliff. Well, you turned it around. That counts for something. We turned it around. It was not just me. It took a lot of people being willing to put in work to fix things. The sky was getting darker. Other people were starting to leave the community center. Karen and I said goodnight and went our separate ways. As I walked back to my house, I thought about everything that had happened over the past 3 years. The fights, the fines, the flood, the reforms. It had been exhausting and stressful and at times infuriating, but it had also been weirdly rewarding. I had learned that sometimes you had to fight back against petty tyrants, even when it seemed easier to just give in. I had learned that revenge could be satisfying, but it was not as fulfilling as actually fixing problems. I had learned that people could change if they were given the right motivation and the right support. And I had learned that living in an HOA did not have to be a nightmare as long as the people running it remembered they were serving a community, not ruling a fiefdom. My generator sat behind my garage, quietly waiting for the next power outage. I checked on it regularly, maintained it properly, ran it for a few minutes every month to keep everything lubricated. It was ready whenever I needed it, but more importantly, I was ready. Ready to stand up for myself if I needed to. Ready to fight against unfair rules. Ready to be a good neighbor while also not being a doormat. The generator war had taught me all of that. It had been an expensive education in some ways, but worth every penny of those fines I had been forced to pay. Because in the end, I had not just gotten my money back. I had gotten something more valuable, self-respect, and the knowledge that standing up to bullies actually could make a difference. The sun had fully set by the time I reached my house. I went inside, poured myself a drink, and sat on my back porch looking out at my yard. The generator hummed quietly in its enclosure behind the garage, a constant reminder of where I had been and how far the neighborhood had come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new neighborhood dynamics to navigate. But tonight, I was content. I had fought my battle with the HOA and won, not through destruction but through forcing change that benefited everyone. And if another Karen Westfield ever took control of the Ridgemont Heights HOA, well, at least now there were safeguards in place to prevent the worst excesses. The reforms we had implemented would outlast all of us, protecting future residents from the kind of petty tyranny that had sparked this whole mess. I finished my drink and went inside. Life in an HOA could be complicated, but it did not have to be a war. Sometimes it just took one person willing to say enough was enough and actually follow through. I had been that person for Ridgemont Heights, and while I would not want to do it again, I was glad I had done it once. The generator sat ready outside, a silent guardian against power outages, and a monument to the principle that sometimes the best defense against unreasonable authority was simply refusing to comply. I had learned that lesson the hard way, but I had learned it well. And that, ultimately, was what mattered most.